On September 10, 2001, United States Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stood at a podium inside the Pentagon and made an announcement that, under normal circumstances, would have dominated the news cycle for weeks. According to some estimates, he said, "We cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions." $2.3 trillion. To understand that number, consider that the entire annual budget of the Pentagon at the time was approximately $300 billion. The amount they could not account for was nearly 8 times their yearly budget. It exceeded the net value of all the plant and equipment owned by every corporation in the United States combined. It was not a rounding error. It was not a budget shortfall. It was $2.3 trillion in transactions that the Department of Defense's own financial systems could not trace, could not match to goods or services received, and could not explain. Under normal circumstances, that number would have produced congressional hearings, public outrage, criminal investigations, and front-page coverage in every newspaper in the country. But the announcement was made on September 10th, and the next morning, the world changed. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, killed nearly 3,000 people and consumed every second of media attention for months. The Pentagon itself was struck. The section of the building that was hit was the Western Wedge, which had recently undergone renovation and was only partially occupied. Among the offices destroyed were financial management and accounting offices for the Army and the Defense Department. Personnel who worked on Pentagon financial records were among the casualties. The Department of the Army would later cite the loss of financial management personnel sustained during the September 11th attack as one reason it could not produce a standalone financial statement for 2001. The story of the missing $2.3 trillion was not suppressed or classified. It was simply buried, not by conspiracy, but by the largest news event in modern American history, arriving less than 24 hours later. By the time the smoke cleared and the country began processing what had happened, the question of where $2.3 trillion had gone was no longer a story anyone was asking about. The nation was at war. Defense spending was about to increase by hundreds of billions of dollars. Questioning the Pentagon's finances became, in the political atmosphere of the time, almost unthinkable. The timing has generated enormous speculation over the years, and it is worth being precise about what is documented and what is not. The speech itself is publicly available. Rumsfeld delivered it at what the Pentagon called Acquisition and Logistics Excellence Week, a bureaucratic reform initiative. He was not confessing to theft. He was describing a systemic failure of financial management so severe that the Defense Department literally could not tell Congress where its money had gone. His exact words described financial systems that were decades old, stored on dozens of technological systems that were inaccessible or incompatible and unable to share information from floor to floor within the same building. The speech framed it as an institutional problem, an enemy within, he called it, though the enemy he described was not sabotage, it was bureaucracy. That framing, however convenient, does not make the number smaller. $2.3 trillion remained unaccounted for regardless of whether the cause was incompetence, corruption, or some combination of both. And the question of what happened to that money has never been answered. To understand how a government department loses track of trillions of dollars, you need to understand how Pentagon accounting actually works, or more accurately, how it does not work. In 1996, Congress passed a law requiring all federal agencies to undergo annual financial audits. Every department of the United States government was required to open its books, document its spending, and submit to independent review. The Internal Revenue Service complied. The Department of Education complied. The Social Security Administration complied. The Department of Defense did not. Not that year. Not the next year. Not for the next 2 decades. The Pentagon is the only federal agency that has never passed a clean audit in the entire history of the requirement. The reason, according to the Pentagon itself, is that its financial systems are too old, too fragmented, and too incompatible to produce the kind of documentation an audit requires. The Defense Department operates hundreds of separate accounting systems that do not communicate with each other. When money moves between departments, between contractors, between bases, between countries, the transaction is recorded in one system, but not necessarily in another. Over time, the discrepancies accumulate. When an account discrepancy occurs that cannot be traced, the standard practice is to make what is called an undocumentable adjustment. The Pentagon adds or subtracts an amount to force the books to balance without knowing where the money actually went. In 1999, the amount the Pentagon adjusted through this process was 8 times the Defense Department budget for that year. 8 times the annual budget, quietly adjusted on paper, with no documentation of what the money was spent on, who received it, or what was delivered in return. The Pentagon has spent tens of billions of dollars over the years attempting to modernize its financial systems to become audit-ready. Many of these modernization programs failed and were abandoned. One system, the Defense Integrated Military Human Resources System, cost over $1 billion before being scrapped entirely. Another, the Expeditionary Combat Support System for the Air Force, consumed over $1 billion over a decade before the Air Force Inspector General declared it had produced nothing of value. The government spent billions trying to build a system that could track where it spent its other billions. It failed at that too. By 2015, the amount reported as unaccounted for by the Office of the Inspector General had risen from $2.3 trillion to $6.5 trillion, and that figure covered the Army alone. When all branches were included, the total undocumentable adjustments reported across the Department of Defense reached $35 trillion by 2019. That number exceeds the entire national debt of the United States at the time. It is important to understand what these numbers represent and what they do not. An undocumentable adjustment is not necessarily evidence of stolen money. It is evidence that the Pentagon's financial systems cannot produce a paper trail connecting a payment to a purpose. Some of the money was almost certainly spent on legitimate programs. Some of it may represent duplicate entries, accounting errors, or transfers that were recorded in one system and not another. But the point is that nobody knows. The Defense Department itself cannot tell you with certainty where trillions of dollars of taxpayer money went. And it has had over 25 years since the audit requirement was passed to figure it out, and still cannot. When Rumsfeld eventually appeared before Congress in March 2005, his testimony offered no substantive answers about the missing funds. The Congressional Budget Office and the Government Accountability Office both assured investigators that hearings would have been held if there were a significant problem. The fact that the problem was significant enough for the Secretary of Defense to publicly announce it, but not significant enough for Congress to investigate, tells you everything about how Washington handles accountability when the numbers become too large to comprehend. The Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan concluded in 2011 that between $31 and $60 billion spent in those two countries alone had been lost to waste, fraud, and abuse. $60 billion in documented waste from just 2 military operations, and even that number attracted minimal sustained public attention. When the baseline of acceptable financial chaos is measured in trillions, billions barely register. A 2013 Reuters investigation found that the Pentagon routinely inserted false numbers into its financial reports to Congress. Not estimates, not projections, fabricated figures designed to make the books appear balanced when they were not. The practice was so widespread that it had a name inside the department: plugging. Accountants would insert a plug number, an invented figure with no supporting documentation, to force a report to reconcile. Reuters described the process as the accounting equivalent of forging a check. In 2018, the Pentagon finally underwent its first comprehensive audit. It employed over 1,200 auditors across multiple firms. The Department of Defense failed. It was not close. The auditors identified hundreds of material weaknesses across every branch. The then Deputy Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, told reporters that he was not surprised and that he had never expected to pass. The Pentagon has failed every subsequent audit since. The question that persists is not whether the money is missing. The Pentagon itself has confirmed repeatedly that it cannot account for it. The question is why there have been no consequences. No criminal investigation has ever been launched into the systemic failure of Pentagon accounting. No senior official has been fired for failing to comply with the 1996 audit requirement. No contractor has been investigated for receiving payments that cannot be traced to delivered goods or services. The $2.3 trillion Rumsfeld announced on September 10, 2001 was not the beginning of the problem. It was the first time a senior official said the number out loud in public. The problem predated his announcement by years and has grown exponentially in the decades since. The total amount of undocumentable adjustments now exceeds the combined economic output of every country on Earth except the United States and China. The speech is still available online. You can watch Rumsfeld deliver it. You can hear him describe the Pentagon's financial systems as an adversary that poses a serious threat to the security of the United States. You can listen to him frame the problem as a bureaucratic challenge that his administration intended to fix. And you can check the date in the corner of the screen and know that within 24 hours, nobody would ever ask about it again. 25 years later, the Pentagon still cannot pass an audit. The trillions remain unaccounted for. The financial systems remain incompatible. The undocumentable adjustments continue to grow. And the announcement that should have been the biggest financial scandal in American government history remains, by accident of timing, one of the least discussed. The money did not disappear. It was spent, somewhere, by someone, on something. The United States government simply cannot tell you what. If you found this important, subscribe to the Midnight Vault. We open the files governments and corporations spent millions trying to keep sealed. New videos every week.